Hello, welcome back to All About Russia. My name is Andrew and today we're going to be looking at the southernmost and perhaps most diverse of all the federal subjects of the Russian Federation, the Republic of Dagestan. The Republic of Dagestan is located in the south of Russia, in the North Caucasian Federal District and in the North Caucasian Economic Region. Within the Russian Federation it shares borders with the Republic of Chechnya to the west, the Stavropol Krai to the northwest, and the Republic of Kalmykia to the north. To the east, the Republic borders the Caspian Sea, whilst internationally it shares borders with Georgia to the southwest and Azerbaijan to the south. As such, Dagestan is the southernmost of all the federal subjects of the Russian Federation, and access to this region actually requires a special visa, as it is seen as a potentially vulnerable border region. The Republic of Dagestan is 19,400 square miles in size, making it the 52nd largest federal subject and larger than the country of Slovakia. As of the 2010 census, there are nearly 3 million people in this republic, making it the 12th most populous part of Russia, with more people living here than in the country of Qatar. The capital of the republic is Makhachkala, which boasts a population of over 500,000 people. Interestingly, the name Makhachkala comes from Makhach, the pseudonym of the Avar Bolshevik Revolution leader Magomed Ali Dagaev, and the Avar suffix kala, meaning fortress or redoubt. So it translates to Makhach's fortress. The name Dagestan comes from a blending of the Turkish word Dag, meaning mountain, and the Persian suffix stan, meaning land of. This is a very apt name, as over half of the republic is mountainous. There are 12 official languages spoken in Dagestan, and in each of those languages the name of the republic is the same, although pronunciation varies from language to language. Overall, there are 5 main geographic regions in Dagestan: the mountainous south, the foothills of the Caucasus, the central plains, the coastal regions, and the arid steppeland in the north. Across this, just 7% of the republic is forested, with a nearly equal amount of land being farmed. It should be noted that Dagestan covers one of 2 direct paths from Asia to Europe across the Caucasus, a fact which has played a huge role in their history. The highest point in the republic is Mount Bazar-Duzu, at nearly 4,500 meters high. It also has the distinction of being the southernmost point in all of Russia. Its name comes from the Azeri language and translates to something along the lines of "turn here for the market." This name made sense a few hundred years ago, when a popular market was held in the nearby Shenabad Valley. As Dagestan is a land of 1,000 tongues, there are other names for the mountain, a popular alternative being the Lezgian Kichlin, which translates to something on the lines of mountain of fear. The longest river in the republic is the river Samur, with over 80 miles of it running through Dagestan. The origin of its name is somewhat disputed, with some believing it to be a corruption of the Lezgian word for the animal marten, or possibly a corruption of the Rutal word for one river. There are actually quite a few more theories, but some of them are pretty far out there. The flag of Dagestan is a tricolour of green, blue and red. The green represents Islam, the dominant faith of many in Dagestan. The blue represents the Caspian Sea, which borders the republic to the east, and the red represents bravery, a trait widely respected in Dagestan. It was adopted on the 19th of November 2003. The Republic of Dagestan consists of 41 administrative districts, with the capital Makhachkala as its own administrative district. Many of these administrative districts are organised on an ethnic basis, and thus many of them are named after the dominant ethnic group in that region. The entire republic runs on Moscow Standard Time. Dagestan is one of the oldest regions of the Russian Federation, with evidence of humanoid activity dating back to 1.4 million years ago. Whether these were Homo sapiens or another species is still unclear. What we do know is, going back as far as 6000 BC, there is evidence of Homo sapiens settling in the area, beginning limited agriculture. Archaeologists believe whoever lived here were part of the Seoni culture and facilitated long-distance trade, with evidence of goods being brought back from as far as Sumer and Anatolia. As mentioned before, Dagestan is home to one of only two easy access routes from Asia to Europe across the Caucasus. This is often called the Derban Pass. This passage was and still is highly valuable, as it acts as a bottleneck for enemies and a vital organ for trade for allies. As such, the oldest city in Russia is Derbent, although that name is relatively recent. The settlement was founded in the 8th century BC, though by who we are not entirely certain. Given its proximity to the Achaemenid Empire in neighbouring Persia, many archaeologists believe the city was, if not directly built by the Persians, then certainly influenced by them. This actually makes a lot of sense, as archaeologists also date the arrival of the Scythians, the nomadic horse people who resided in southern Russia and Ukraine, from around the 8th century as well. Given the Scythians' penchant for raiding, it is very plausible that somebody built a fortress in Derbent to halt their advance. As with much of prehistory, we have very little to go on, based on limited archaeological finds and primarily theories about what could have happened, as very little, if anything, was written during the time. Somehow, whether peacefully or otherwise, by the 4th century BC, several tribes and people had coalesced into the state of Caucasian Albania, and allied itself with the Persian Achaemenid Empire. It should be noted that the extent of Caucasian Albania is disputed. Did it cover all of Dagestan? Just the southern part? We have no real way of knowing. What we can say, and with a degree of certainty, that this proximity to the Achaemenid Empire led to the introduction of Zoroastrianism into Dagestan, with archaeologists finding evidence of temples and passages from around the Derbent area. By the 2nd century AD, the Greek historian Arrian of Gaugamela was recording that the peoples of Dagestan, as part of the wider tributary and conquesting system of the Achaemenid Empire, had fought against the armies of Alexander the Great, in true Dagestani fashion, plundering his camp before escaping to the mountains. The historian Strabo, writing in the 1st century BC, records Caucasian Albania in terms that are reminiscent of modern Dagestan, a land of 26 languages with a plethora of petty kings under one archking. Again, whether this is true or not, we cannot be certain. However, given Dagestan's fame for its diversity and many languages even today, it does again seem very plausible. The wealth passing through Dagestan via the Derban Pass made Dagestan an attractive place, not just for the Persians. In 66 BC, Caucasian Albania was invaded by the Roman army under General Pompey as part of a wider struggle against the Persians. Whilst a nominal overlordship was accepted by the Albanians, attempts to revolt 30 years later led to a more concentrated Roman effort. It should be mentioned that much of this occupation and fighting occurred in southern Dagestan. Much of the central and northern parts of Dagestan were left independent without influence from the great powers nearby. Unfortunately, this also means there is not a lot written about them. From the 1st to the 3rd century AD, southern Dagestan, along with Armenia and Azerbaijan, would be a war zone between the competing Roman Republic, then Empire, and the Persian Parthian, then Sassanid, empires. Derbent would exchange hands several times over the centuries, with competing Zoroastrian, pagan, and of course Christian influence during these centuries. With the conversion to Christianity by Armenia in the 1st century AD, missionaries began travelling to Dagestan, both along the coast and into the mountains. With the later conversion of neighbouring Georgia in the 3rd century, a greater Christian influence grew across Dagestan. This was actually quite problematic, as by the end of the 3rd century, Caucasian Albania was firmly in the grasp of the Persians, who not only were Zoroastrians, but were actively persecuting Christianity at that time. Thus, perhaps in response to this growing Christian element in Dagestan, in the 4th century, a Persianization of the Dagestani lowlands occurred, with entire families being resettled around the Derbent area, giving the city its new name. Quite practically, Derbent actually translates to something in the line of barrier opening in the Persian tongue. New walls and new defences were added around this time as well, to help create an outpost of Persian culture and Zoroastrianism among a sea of barbarian and Christian peoples. Now, much of its early history has focused on southern Dagestan. So what was happening in the north? Since around the 1st century, Alan tribes had been grazing, trading and invading from the north, either moving into empty land or displacing Scythian tribes living there. This is in part why Derbent was seen as a frontier by both the Romans and Persians, and given great importance. In the 3rd century AD, the Huns poured into Europe, including Dagestan. This was a chaotic time, as it saw waves of refugees from different ethnic and linguistic groups pour into the region, as well as the Huns themselves, forcing some peoples to flee to the mountains and valleys of central Dagestan. This period is a direct reason as to why Dagestan is so diverse both linguistically and ethnically. As chaotic as when they arrived, the collapse of the Hunnic Empire brought pandemonium to Dagestan. This period saw the emergence of dozens of small ethno-states or clans across Dagestan. The Balanjas, the Tsakur Khanate, the Kaitak, just to name a few of them. This was a century of flux and change, and incredibly little information has been gathered on it. Much of this information we are taking from archaeological sources, but in equal measure from oral tradition from the people living in Dagestan today. By the 5th century AD, Sassanid anti-Christian rhetoric was in full swing. This made Dagestan, at that time ever growing more Christian, a hotbed of discontent. During this time, more and more ethno-states began to emerge. Look, I'm just going to list them here. This is how many of them there are. It's absurd. A big reason why so many of these ethno-states began to emerge and were able to maintain their independence for a very long time comes back to the geography of Dagestan. Over half of Dagestan is made up of mountains. So the idea of gathering up your warriors and imposing your will on the next village in the next valley is unlikely at best, impossible at worst. This was a time before motorways, or even dedicated and maintained pathways. If you couldn't climb to the valley when the weather was good, you were not going. Bear this in mind as we discuss the history of Dagestan. During this time, another great power appeared from the north, the Khazars. The Khazars were a nomadic Jewish entity who, amazingly, imposed themselves on many of the smaller communities and tribes of Dagestan. By 562 AD, the Khazars were posing such a threat that the Sassanids re-fortified Derbent with imposing walls to deter the new barbarians. The Khazars would impose tribute on the people living on the plains and coast of Dagestan, though largely left the mountain communities alone due to sheer inaccessibility. In 630 AD, they conquered the Balanja tribes, taking their capital for their own. Ironically, whilst the Sassanids had fortified their northern border, they had done little about their southern one, a decision which would have huge ramifications for the people of Dagestan. In 633, the Muslim armies of the Prophet Muhammad invaded Persia, reaching Derbent by 643. The governor of Derbent, faced with a large, well-drilled army under Abd ar-Rahman ibn Rabi'a, opted to surrender, accepting to pay the jizya tax for his Zoroastrian faith. Whilst brave, Abd ar-Rahman was not wise, and would die 20 years later trying to expand into the Khazar territory. This invasion would prompt a century of tit-for-tat raids and invasions between the Khazars and their allies and the Arab forces. Both sides would make huge gains, only to lose them, both sides plundering Derbent several times over a century. The tribes of Dagestan were not immune to this conflict, and often pledged their loyalty and services to whoever was on the ascendancy. What's more, this constant warfare led to instability. This instability led to many tribes seeking protection and fleeing to the mountains, where they formed new ethno-states. This will be a reoccurring theme in the video. By the closing of the 8th century, the Muslim world had fractured and was beginning to fight itself, with various factions appearing and seceding. In 797, the Khazars launched one last raid, penetrating deep into the Muslim world beyond the Caucasus. The Muslims were unable to coordinate an effective response, leaving the Khazars to return with booty galore. By 861, a neighbouring power had emerged, the Emirate of Shirvan, formed from the satrap of Caucasian Albania, which also laid claim to much of southern Dagestan. 8 years later, Derbent itself would revolt, establishing the Emirate of Derbent. Oddly, this is another pattern we will see repeated throughout the video, as both of these Persian-influenced Islamic states were vying with each other for access to the profitable Derbent Pass. Despite winning the Arab-Khazar wars, the Khazars themselves were not in great shape, they themselves being harried by a power to the north. This century would see the first Russians appear in the story of Dagestan, with a reported raid by the Kievan Rus along the Caspian shores in 917. Unable to maintain order, the Khazars' own client state of Saria revolted, allying with other Christian Caucasian powers, notably Alania. The 10th century appears to have been the zenith of Christianity in Dagestan, with Islam beginning to erode its influence and control from this point forward. So too does this stand testament to the power of the Khazars, who began to lose influence and control from this century forward. A weakened frontier with the Rus allowed for Cumans to drift into Dagestan, putting pressure on those communities on the plains and further weakening Khazar authority. In the south, the Emirates of Derbent and Shirvan would vie for supremacy, weakening each other in the process. Attacked by the Alans and finally by the Seljuk Turks to the east, fell the Emirate of Shirvan in 1066 and led to a Turkification of their lands, including the southern part of Dagestan. During this time, the Avars, who we did a whole video on which you can check out over here, were emerging as a power in their own right and forged their own alliance with a neighbouring power, the Khwarezmiya Empire. Dagestan had been a land blighted with war ever since the first pen came to parchment recording its history. But the arrival of the Mongols in 1222 was unlike nothing seen before. Arriving in Dagestan and opting for the tougher but unguarded Kurmuk Pass, the Mongols ravaged the villages of Andi, Avars, Dargans and others they met before moving onto the land of Alania in the east. This foray into Dagestan was just a raid, but spelled bad tidings for the rest of Dagestanis, unable to use their own tactics of mountain warfare effectively against the skilled warriors of Mongolia. 4 years later, the last emperor of the Khwarezmian Empire, who was abandoned by his Avar allies I should add, arrived outside the walls of Derbent. He planned to take the city and create an anti-Mongol alliance centred there. This failed miserably and he actually fled to Turkey. But this was also the last real chance for the Dagestanis to unite and repel the Mongols, and they would soon pay the price for their disunity. In 1239, returning from another invasion of Alania, the Mongols poured down from the north and east, capturing Derbent themselves. Because there was no cohesion, the Mongols could pick villages off piecemeal, and untold thousands fled to the mountains for safety, as the Mongols burned, raped, and pillaged across the mountains. By 1255, a sort of status quo had established itself. With Mongol rule established firmly in the south, the Highland society began to morph and change as new waves of refugees arrived. As you might expect, a trickle of contact began to emerge between the Dagestanis and the Mongols, intermittently trading and even working as mercenaries for the Mongols. When the Burqa-Hulagu War erupted across Dagestan, villages found themselves in either Golden Horde or Ukhamit territory, and suffered greatly because of it. This led to further exoduses of people to the hills. Curiously, we actually start to see a greater Islamic influence in Dagestan from around this time. This might have come about because of the destruction of Christian powers in the Caucasus around this time, or possibly from waves of Islamic refugees from the east. Nevertheless, by 1313 both the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate had adopted Islam as their state religions, and thus provided a boost for mullahs in the region. From 1318 onward, conflict between these two great Mongol powers would wreak havoc across Dagestan. What is worth bearing in mind is each of these conflicts led to more people fleeing to the mountains. This also led to new groups encountering each other, new ideas emerging, and new states emerging in the mountains and hills of Dagestan. Around this time, in the village of Kurmuk, an Islamic centre of power emerged evolving into the state of Gazikumuk, a Lak ethno-state. After over a century of Mongol punishments, the last great Mongol invasion occurred towards the end of the century, when Tamerlane arrived, storming Derbent and pouring into Dagestan proper. By fire and sword, Tamerlane punished the Dagestanis for assisting both the Ilkhanate, then the Golden Horde. And many oral traditions in Dagestan today speak of the horror inflicted on them by Tamerlane during this time. With the death of Tamerlane, his empire began to fragment. Two new regional powers arose, the Shamkhalate of the Kaitag in the mountains and the Shamkhalate of Derbent in the lowlands. At this point, I should probably explain what a Shamkhalate is. Historians aren't quite sure where the term has come from. It could have been a term for a particular person, much as we have seen with the Kabardians or the Nogai. It equally possibly could have been a rank in either the Lezgian or Kumyk languages. Regardless, in effect a Shamkhalate was very similar to a Khanate or a princedom, with a select few on top and the majority having to serve below. Bear this term in mind, as you will hear it several times throughout the video. The legacy of Islam had put the people of Dagestan into closer contact not only with their neighbours to the south and north, but also to the west. Firearms, bought from the Ottomans and later from the Persians, began to revolutionise warfare in the mountains. In 1437, the Emirate of Shirvan once again took over the Shamkhalate of Taki and dominated the entire lowland trade. Mullahs and missionaries from Gazikumuk began to be sent to convert those hill tribes who still resisted Islam outside of Dagestan, namely the Chechens and Alans. There is something of an irony with Dagestan becoming an Islamic centre, proselytising into other regions, when their ancestors had directly opposed Islam during the Khazar period. It should also be mentioned that the Islam practiced by these Dagestanis, very much like the Christianity they had practiced, would have been syncretic with native beliefs and religions, something that we will learn a little bit more about later in this video. Falling under the sway of the Emirate of Shirvan, the Derban Emirate became mixed between Iranian and Turkic peoples, with a smattering of Caucasian peoples from the hills as well. Maintaining their own independence for just over a century, eventually the Emirate of Shirvan too fell to the influence of their neighbour, the Safavid Persians, becoming a satrap of their empire. An important detail here is that the Safavids were Shia Muslims, not Sunnis like most of the people of Dagestan. During this century of independence, Dagestan continued as a patchwork of independent states and Shamkhalates, applying pressure and overlordship on a very fleeting basis. An exception to this was the Kumyk people of the Khamsin ethnic state, who expanded into the Islamically inspired Ultamish Sultanate, encompassing a central position in Dagestan from their base in Ultamish. 1556 once again saw Dagestan come under the radar of the Russians. A Kabardian envoy, at this time still an Orthodox people, arrived in Moscow to create an anti-Kaitag Shamkhalate alliance. This was because the Kaitags had begun expanding and putting pressure on the Kabardians to the west, who themselves were expanding eastward at this time. This was not the first time that the Caucasus had been in Russian foreign policy. However, it would mark the start of the first genuine Russian interest in the region. As the clashes between the Kaitags and the Kabardians continued, the Russians sent an army in 1560, headed by General Ivan Cheremissov, to punish the Shamkhalate. They defeated a Kaitag force and put Taki, then a fortress on the outskirts of Makhachkala, to the torch. But there was still an awful lot of land between Moscow and Dagestan, and in 1557 3 Cossacks, note not Russians, Cossacks, from the Volga established the settlement of Tursky on the Terek River. The Cossacks were not the only newcomers to the region during this time. For failing to honour alliances to assist in war against the Safavids, the Ottomans themselves invaded Dagestan, making the Dagestani lords come to heel with cannon and shot, acquiring Derbent as an Ottoman city wrested from the Persians. The Russian state first establishes territory in Dagestan at this time as well, as the Tumen Principality, a principality founded by Tatars and formerly subject of the Kaytak Khalate, was inherited by two Tatar brothers who had found service in the Russian army. This actually made the northern part of Dagestan Russian territory, at least in name if not in fact. Ottoman control in Dagestan was light, with Shia Islam still widely practiced in the southern part of Dagestan. However, Ottoman mullahs and missionaries were active in the western part of Dagestan, increasing the number of Avar clans who adhered to Sunni Islam. In 1603, a new war broke out between Persia and the Ottoman Empire, which resulted in Derbent and the surrounding lands being recaptured. Under the Treaty of Nasur Pasha, the whole of Dagestan was nominally under Persian control, though as we have seen throughout history, this is largely in name only, as the mountainous tribes were largely inaccessible. 2 years later, under duress from Dagestani raids, the King of Georgia, Alexander II, asked for Russian assistance. This led to the Battle of Karaman, where flintlock armed Dagestanis massacred the punitive force of Russians. This led to reinforcements being sent not only to the Cossack settlement of Tersky, who at this point had accepted Russian protection, but also to the Tumen Principality in the north. Gradually, Russian troops were beginning to appear in Dagestan on a more permanent basis. The Kaytak Khalate, or Gazi Kumuk as it is otherwise known, had experienced several decades of expansion and stability, but in 1623 all of that came crashing down. A civil war erupted from the ruling family, which led not only to there being unrest and instability, but to many of their vassals and client states breaking away and becoming independent. Among these new states were the Tabarsan ethno-state and the Tarkov Khalate, present at Tarki, on the outskirts of modern Makhachkala. During this century, the Persians would once again attempt greater influence in Dagestan, trying to recruit many of the highland clans and tribes into their own forces in 1651 as they fought the Russians. This war came about from Cossack trepidations against the Persian-aligned satrap of Shirvan, to which the Tsar refused to try and stop. Burning down the Cossack fort of Tersky in the north and massacring the garrison on the Sunza River, the Russians sued for peace. In a position of strength in Dagestan, the Persians tried a policy of pacification by enforcing their own Shia decrees, as well as resettling loyal Turkoman tribes throughout Dagestan. In a weird way, this actually has a parallel to what the British were doing in Ireland at the time, resettling loyal ethnic groups and manipulating religious divides. And as you might imagine, this did not go very well. Eventually, in 1712, a Sunni revolt under Haji Dawood saw several of the communities of Dagestan rise in revolt against their Shia overlord. This had been brewing for some time, with the Kumiks actually revolting earlier in 1657. But the instability in Persia and the Shah Hussein was seen as the catalyst of the revolt by many. Most of southern Dagestan, including the Shia outposts of Derbent and Azerbaijan, fell to Haji Dawood and his forces. The Safavid Persians were completely unable to stop this revolt, as at that time they were actually trying to quell several other revolts across their vast empire. Russian interest in Dagestan had not ended in 1653, and Tsar Peter the Great chose now as the time to strike against the fracturing Persian Empire. In 1722, a huge Russian army both sailed from Astrakhan and travelled overland into Dagestan. The reaction of the Dagestanis themselves was actually quite mixed. Haji Dawood's forces opposed both the Tsar and the Shah, and were joined by the Ultamish Sultanate and the Gazi Kumuk Khalate as well. Yet some in Dagestan actually saw the Russians as liberators from Shia oppression, notably the Khalate of Tarki, who actually assisted the Russians as they advanced. In a lightning campaign, the Treaty of St. Petersburg ceded Dagestan as well as parts of Azerbaijan to the Russian Empire. Wisely, the Tsar figured to rule lightly in this rebellious and mountainous region. Though in addition to rebuilding fortresses on the Sunza and Terek rivers, he also encouraged more Cossack stanitsas and Russian migration into the plains of Dagestan. Mistaking this light rule for weakness, and encouraged by the Ottomans, the Turkish Khanate revolted against the Tsar. Yes, dear viewer, that would be the same Khanate that actually helped the Russians earlier. They were quickly crushed and removed from the pages of history altogether with the abolishment of that Khanate. Dagestan at this time was not in the governorate of Russia and was, as previously mentioned, largely independent. In fact, one of the key reasons for this, and the reasons the Persians knew quite well, was that the mountainous nature of Dagestan meant that you could not rule the region without consent. For many people in Dagestan, they did not know they were meant to be subjects of the Tsar. Some of them had not even known they were meant to be subjects of the Shah. In our previous videos, we have touched upon the fact that because it is so mountainous and so inaccessible, the ideas of borders and lines drawn on a map mean very little to the people of Dagestan. For many then, and today, the world is the village, and on a macro level, maybe the valley. As such, their independence was, and is, fiercely defended. Traditionally, there have been three great powers in the Caucasus: the Persians, the Ottomans, and the Russians. Persia, having recovered from their instability under Nader Shah, defeated the Ottomans in 1735, and this created a dilemma for the Russians. Faced with a resurgent Persia, imminent war with the Ottomans themselves, and a distant land which is difficult to control and not especially profitable, the Tsarina Anna I opted for something surprising. She agreed to cede Dagestan back to the Persians. Under the Treaty of Ganja, yes, that is what it's called, Dagestan was given back to the Persians in return for a defensive alliance against the Ottomans. This, whilst considered by many as a masterful piece of diplomacy, was really something of a poisoned chalice. Once again, it put the Persians into conflict with their Sunni vassals, attempting the impossible: to impose their will on the mountains. Invading twice before in 1734 and 1735 respectively, to subdue the lowland hold of Derbent and subdue the Cossacks and Lezgins, one final invasion was launched in 1741. The aim of Nader Shah was to subdue the Dagestanis once and for all, using the failure of the Ghazi Kumuk Khanate to pay tribute as a pretext for invasion. Encouraged by his previous successes, the Shah brought an army in the tens of thousands to Dagestan, only to have them whittled away by guerrilla tactics from the Dagestanis. Notably, the Avar Khanate, at this point a Sunni power in the region, led the campaign, though their victory over the oppressive Shah is actually commemorated in many of the oral traditions of the people of Dagestan, not just the Avars. Retreating to Persia, the Avar Khanate moved to fill the gap, asserting themselves as the regional power in central Dagestan. Outside pressures and a common religion made, for the first time in many years, it much simpler to create a unified system of alliances and pacts across Dagestan, with the Avars in the ascendancy. Nader Shah's death in 1747 saw the governor of Derbent revolt against the Persians and create the Derbent Khanate. Being Persian but Sunni, the Khanate was at odds with many of its neighbours for one reason or another, and the death of the Shah did not bring peace to Dagestan. At the same time, to the south, the Kuba Khanate had arisen and, feuding with the Derbent Khanate, as is tradition at this point, succeeded in conquering it in 1765. By the 1780s, Persia had stabilised, and the new Shah, Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar, was flexing his muscles in the Caucasus. Having taken on eastern Georgia as a protectorate, when Shah Aga invaded, it dragged the Russians into another Persian war. Yet this proved something of a mixed bag, as it convinced the Avar Khanate to accept Russian protection against the warlike, heretical Shah. This situation allowed relatively unimpeded access for the Russian army, who took Derbent in 1806. A fear of events in Europe and conflict with the Turks distracted Russia from pressing further against Persia, and by 1813 a peace treaty was hammered out. The Treaty of Gulistan ceded the whole of Dagestan to Russia. Again, further Cossack immigration was encouraged, particularly among the good farmland along the Terek and Sunza rivers. This appearance of infidels along some of the best land in Dagestan upset some Muslims in Dagestan, but no real action was taken. For as long as people could remember, Dagestan was a land of tribes and tribal customs. Blood oaths, cattle rustling and idolatry were ubiquitous in that region. Yet in 1823, Mullah Hassan Muhammad arrived in Dagestan with a radical new religious philosophy. Rejecting the tribal customs of eons, he encouraged a purity of the Islam of the Caucasus, adhering to Sharia law with strong elements of Sufism, the Murid philosophy. Beginning with the Avars and Lesgians, he converted many to his new way of thinking. In 1826, war erupted between Persia and Russia. The Persians once again tried to retake Dagestan, but were soundly defeated by the Russians. This was so much so they actually ended up losing even more land under the Treaty of Turkmenchay. This led to Persian influence in Dagestan, which had been there since at least the 8th century BC, being permanently lost. Yet international affairs were only one part of the Dagestani story, as the very next year Imam Ghazi Muhammad, the first of the Murid leaders, attempted to take the Avar capital of Kunzak. He failed and retreated with his followers to try again another day, but this act was evident of a profound change occurring in Dagestan at this time. Whereas before your loyalty had been to the family, to the clan, to the village, now it could belong to something greater, to Islam itself. Rejecting the Treaty of Turkmenchay, Imam Ghazi Muhammad declared the Caucasian Imamate and began the Murid War, a conflict that would last for over 30 years. Rallying the dispossessed of many ethnicities in the Caucasus, he began raiding Cossack stanitsas, forts, even reaching as far as Vladikavkaz. Not since the time of the Mongols had the Dagestanis experienced such profound social change. With the death of Ghazi Muhammad in battle against the Russians, Mullah Gamzak Bek rose to leadership and successfully took the Avar Khanate for himself in 1834. Many in Dagestan saw his cause as a righteous one and flocked to his banner. However, his adherence to a purity of Islam led to him attempting to stamp out some of the more syncretic beliefs that still existed in the Islam practiced amongst the Caucasian people. This was not well received and actually led to his assassination. The Caucasian Imamate was then led by a man often referred to as the Lion of Dagestan, Imam Shamil. Shamil had fought alongside Ghazi Muhammad and used his experience and position in Dagestani society. He formulated a terribly effective guerrilla warfare strategy. Realizing the strength of the Dagestanis was from the very mountains they resided in, his lightning attacks and retreats brought untold death to thousands of Russian soldiers and inspired several notable works in the 19th century. One of the reasons Imam Shamil is so fondly and well remembered in the Caucasus is not just that he held off the Russians for over 30 years, but he also laid the groundwork for modern Islam in Dagestan today. An Islamic constitution was created in 1847 by Shamil, which cemented the rule of Sharia law and the outlawing of various tribal practices. Russian attention at this time was divided, with operations in the Western Caucasus, in Crimea, as well as in Poland. Among several forts erected at this time to prevent free movement of the Murid warriors, one called Petrovskoye was founded near the ruins of Tarki, on the site of modern-day Makhachkala. By 1856, Russia had settled its various conflicts and uprisings and could now turn its full force to the mountains, pouring in legions of men, with orders to torch villages and kill any who resisted. The Lion of Dagestan fought a desperate rearguard action before eventually surrendering in 1859. The surrender of Imam Shamil did not end the fighting, and for a good decade afterwards, the Russian army were conducting operations across Dagestan to weed out and destroy the last remnants of his army. By 1860, the various titles and chieftains and khanates of Dagestan had been destroyed by the invading Russians, and the entire region, for the first time, was actually united under Russian rule. The region was split, with the northern part under the Terek Oblast and the rest into the Dagestan Oblast, with the capital at Buynaksk. The intermittent banditry, poor farmland on average, and substantial non-Slavic communities made immigration by Russians unappealing, and only a few settled in the central and southern regions. Despite the plethora of Russian forts in the region, communications between the Dagestanis and both the Ottoman and Persian empires was undertaken regularly. In 1877, at the outbreak of the Russian-Ottoman War, martial law was declared across the whole of Dagestan. This was because the Russian authorities feared that Dagestan would act as a fifth column for the invading Ottomans. As it turns out, this fear was well founded, as the Ottomans had been communicating with the Dagestanis to arrange such an uprising. The revolt lasted from March to October, attacking both forts and civilians alike. A strong Russian force re-entered the mountains in October and began pacifying the oblast. This, in a sense, was the last great attempt by the Dagestanis to throw off Russian imperialism. Times had changed, however, and modern technology and logistics enabled the Russians to counter this effectively. In response, further impositions and restrictions were imposed on the Dagestanis. Concluding that war, a period of peace, or depending on who you ask, a police state, began in Dagestan. Modernity arrived in 1894, with a railway line in Makhachkala, then still called Petrovskoye, linking it with distant Moscow, over 1,000 kilometers away. This time also saw a limited number of schools open in Dagestan, bringing literacy rates up, though still in remarkably poor numbers. Whilst illiteracy was not uncommon in the Russian Empire, in Dagestan it was almost expected. The 20th century not only brought schools and trains to Dagestan, but it also brought a period of great upheaval, tremendous confusion, and even opportunities for the people of Dagestan. In 1914, with the outbreak of the First World War between the imperial powers of Europe, Russia found itself fighting Turkey in the Caucasus. The legacy of 1877 was still in the air, and the Muslim Dagestanis were forbidden from joining the army, for fear of them acquiring weapons and then becoming another fifth column. Furthermore, to prevent such a thing happening, Cossacks from the Terek were recruited to help police Dagestan, to help stem any potential revolt. Despite being on the wrong side of the Caucasus where the fighting was happening, the military presence in Dagestan was substantial, and this situation continued up until March 1917. Despite literacy being rare in Dagestan, an intelligentsia had arisen among the various ethnic groups at that time. Reading about the Tsar's abdication and the establishment of a provisional government, these men met during March and discussed the formation of a pan-Caucasian entity. As the Tsarist Empire began to fall into flames of discord, an independent North Caucasian Mountain Republic was declared on the 11th of March. Chaos nevertheless reigned, and by May the situation had deteriorated. A union of Highlanders of Dagestan was formed across several ethnic groups, with the single purpose of restoring law and order. As opposed to the Mountain Republic, this was a rudimentary organisation, essentially a defensive pact from several different communities in the mountains of Dagestan. However, their efforts, oddly enough, were sponsored by the newly independent Azerbaijan, who had a vested interest in a secure and stable northern border. Despite their efforts, chaos was the order of the day. By November, banditry and raiding had evolved into ethnic running battles and political lynch mobs. By December, a provisional government on the banks of the Terek was formed to try and halt Cossack Dagestani trepidations. Being a coalition government, they also had many different spectrums of political thought, and in March, a coup within the provisional government led the Terek Republic to become the Terek Soviet Republic. Emboldened, the Bolsheviks tried to seize Derbent, which was repelled, though not without heavy losses for the Bolsheviks, and a massacre of the Christians who lived in Derbent, who were believed to be in league with the Bolsheviks. A month later, the Bolsheviks returned, with greater numbers and better arms, and took not only Derbent, but much of southern Dagestan as well. This control was loose at best, however, and a revolution in neighbouring Azerbaijan turned that financial support for the Mountain Republic, who still claimed to rule southern Dagestan, into claims for themselves on the Derbent region. Chaos once again flexed its muscles as a fourth element entered the fray: the White Army. Cossacks, who by and large did not agree with Bolshevism, aided the White Army as it marched into Dagestan, leading to several close battles. By July 1918, the Bolsheviks had not only held their ground, but actually chipped away at the Mountain Republic, creating the North Caucasian Soviet Republic to replace the Terek Soviet Republic. In August, the south of Dagestan was lost to White forces, with air support from the British, who had crossed over from Persia to assist the Whites. The British were not the only international players in Dagestan at this time, and the following month, Turkish forces took Boynatsk and declared it the capital of their ally, the Mountain Republic. White leader Prince Tarkovsky took control of Durban on behalf of the White Army, but allowed his men to behave so atrociously, the Turks learned of this and actually drove them out of the city. The Turks had long had a geopolitical interest in Dagestan and took this opportunity to recruit locally amongst the Dagestanis, seeing them both as a friendly and expendable garrison. November would be a black month for Turkish ambitions, however. Whilst they had done exceedingly well in the Caucasus, they had done terribly in other fronts of the World War. An Anglo-French force informed the Ottomans of the armistice terms, that they had lost the war, and the Turks reluctantly began to withdraw, leaving the Mountain Republic to fend for itself. Threatened by Bolsheviks to the north, they asked for British protection, but this was denied. Officially, this was a matter for the Paris Peace Convention, but in reality, the Mountain Republic had no role to play in British aims for the region. British interests were heavily invested in the White cause, and the RAF used Dagestan to launch bombing campaigns against the Bolsheviks in Astrakhan in the north of the Caspian. By February 1919, things were looking quite positive for the White Army. Overrunning the Bolsheviks in the Terek Soviet Republic, the Whites began to consolidate control in all parts of the Caucasus, including Dagestan. Fearful of a White invasion, the Mountain Republic threw its lot in with Azerbaijan in a desperate attempt to survive, becoming a part of the new Azerbaijani Democratic Republic. The Azeris were in no position to enforce this, however, and White leader Anton Denikin swept into Dagestan. He dissolved the Mountain Republic, placing the entire region into the armed forces of South Russia. Yet despite this, banditry and lawlessness continued to prevail in Dagestan. The White forces were only really able to secure and pacify the coastal and plainal areas of Dagestan. The hills and mountains, as always, remained with the Dagestanis. The Dagestanis who lived in eastern Dagestan, near the Chechen border, were among the last who had surrendered during the Murid War, and were still some of the most steadfast of enemies of the Whites. Thus, in September 1919, when the White forces were facing defeat on the Terek and the British had fled, a movement emerged that rallied those Dagestanis who detested the imperial trepidations of the Whites, the North Caucasian Emirate. Under Said Magomed, his emirate received official protectorate status from the Ottoman Turks and was supported by the Bolsheviks, who no doubt saw it as a thorn in the side of the White forces. The Ottoman Empire, however, was beginning to rapidly fall apart, and the White forces were shattered, retreating towards Crimea and eventual evacuation. In March 1920, the Bolshevik army re-entered Dagestan, occupying Petrovskoye on the 30th. And how did the Dagestanis react? With bayonets and gunfire? Well, no. For the past 3 years, Dagestan had been a battlefield, and the people were sick and tired of fighting for no good reason. At least no good reason that appealed to the Dagestanis. Whilst the communists had initially refused any notion of national determination or autonomy, the years of fighting had brought their minds round, and thus the Dagestanis welcomed the Bolsheviks as partners, assured of their autonomy and freedom within the Soviet system. It should be noted that Said Magomed conveniently died as the Bolsheviks were approaching, making the integration of his Caucasian emirate much smoother. Bolshevik rule throughout the 1920s was, quite wisely, light, remote, underdeveloped, multi-ethnic and without many resources. The region was largely left autonomous by the state. One of the few immediate changes that was made was the renaming of Petrovskoye to Makhachkala. This was done for 2 reasons. Firstly, it was part of Bolshevik policy to remove all of the imperial and Tsarist names from cities and settlements across the former Tsarist Empire. Secondly, it honoured an Avar revolutionary who had been instrumental in the Red success in Dagestan in the earlier part of the Civil War. However, Other changes began to appear around 1926. A census conducted by the Bolsheviks found the Avars as the majority in the region. It also found illiteracy, fundamentalism and pan-Turkism prevalent in the region and acted to stamp out all three, closing Sharia courts in Dagestan. Many roads were built across the valleys and hills, allowing for greater ease for the mountain communities to move to the plains for work and education. Oil and gas deposits were soon discovered off the coast of the Caspian Sea, and despite being exploited, still left Dagestan as one of the most underdeveloped and poorest parts of the Soviet Union. The 1930s saw the region incorporated into the North Caucasian Krai, only to be removed once again in 1936. This was done for political reasons as much as it was for economic reasons, with Dagestan being pretty much the poor relation to the other parts of the Caucasus at that time. Now, it's important to clarify this is not to say there was no investment in Dagestan. There certainly was, but much of it was concentrated on the coastal and plainal areas. Very little of it ended up in the mountainous and hilly parts of Dagestan. In a strange parallel, when the Bolsheviks began trying to stamp out religion in the Caucasus, their toughest resistance came from the highlands, though no full resistance movement emerged like in neighbouring Chechnya. The Second World War passed much of Dagestan, though thousands left their mountain homes to fight in the Red Army. The Germans never made it into Dagestan proper, briefly seizing some of the villages on the border with Chechnya. In a sense, this was a defining moment for the people of Dagestan, sending their sons and daughters to fight for a country they were not yet wholly part of. Thousands moved down to the plains to work the vacant farms and factories of Dagestan, some ironically occupying land their forefathers had been driven off of, leading to a cultural shift for many Dagestanis. Or they may have been Avar or Kumyk or Lak, or even from specific villages, but now they were Soviets, a people of the Union who had spent blood and tears to keep it. The Dagestani effort was rewarded by Stalin, who gave part of the Chechen English Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic to them in 1944. By the 1950s, Sovietization was in full swing, and many Dagestanis had moved across the Soviet Union in search for work, education and a better life. When the Chechens returned home, this led to a repatriation of many of the nationalities who had settled in their republic. Yet largely there was no ill will between the Dagestanis and the Chechens, as many Chechens understood this had been done from orders on top rather than them themselves. Islam had existed in Dagestan since around the 10th century, and a few decades of Soviet rule was not enough to remove its influence. Gradual loosenings of state control led to more public adherence to the faith, though it should be stated many Dagestanis did lose their faith once away from the villages. In the 1970s, two catastrophic things occurred. Firstly, a terrible earthquake racked Dagestan, leaving thousands without homes. Secondly, the 1970s also saw the influx of mullahs from Jordan, arriving in the Sumadinsky district, preaching a particular brand of Islam, Wahhabism. As the Soviet Union stagnated and began to decline, problems associated with the latter arose. Despite upgrading itself from an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic to a full Soviet Socialist Republic in 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union led to economic pandemonium in Dagestan, and Arabian funds trickled into funding Wahhabist mosques. Islamic teaching boomed in the 1990s, reaching from the villages into the towns and cities. For many Dagestanis, this was as much a reclaiming of their culture as it was of their faith. The instability that came with the economic downturn led to violence and the flight of the Jewish community in Dagestan, a group that had existed since the time of the Sassanid Empire. At the same time, in neighbouring Chechnya, a similar story was playing out, and one that would affect the people of Dagestan. In 1996, Chechen separatists seized the Dagestani village of Kyzylar. During the shootout between the separatists and Russian forces, 41 innocent Dagestanis were killed. Yet despite this, there was a growing support for an Islamic entity in Dagestan, with the Kadar Gorge actually becoming something of an Islamic commune, preaching Wahhabism. On the 1st of August 1999, Chechen forces under Shamil Basayev invaded Dagestan, quickly taking the Andy village of Botlik. Basayev was under the impression that the Dagestanis would welcome the Chechens as liberators and co-religionists and help them in their struggle against the Russians. He was sorely mistaken. This was, in part, because the Chechens and Dagestanis had had very different experiences under both the Russian and Soviet systems. Refused accommodation or supplies, the Chechens quickly found themselves in hostile territory and were cleared from Dagestani soil by the 15th of September by Russian state forces. Though some in Dagestan had opted to support the Chechens, they were few and far between and were arrested during those operations. This included the Wahhabis of the Kadar Gorge. Since 1999, Dagestan has faced several incursions by Islamic militants, several of them homegrown. Jamaat Sharia, the new Caucasian Emirate, ISIS and the Taliban have all operated in Dagestan in the 21st century, inflicting terrible terrorist attacks on the people of Dagestan. This has led to a large anti-terrorist task force being in operation in Dagestan right up to 2016, where operations were declared a success, though some incidents are still occurring and are regularly thwarted by the Dagestani police. The fact that some of these terrorist organisations and incidents have been extended to Moscow, Volgograd and other parts of the Russian Federation has given Dagestan a sinister reputation as something of a fundamentalist hotbed. Whether that is fair or not, I cannot say. What I can say, however, is Dagestan certainly was a hotbed for corruption. In 2018, a massive anti-corruption campaign snared dozens of officials, including the then mayor of Makhachkala, Abusyan Hasanov. Much of this corruption was the embezzlement of state funds, so now might be quite a good time to look at where those funds were coming from. Dagestan is primarily a rural economy, with over half of the population employed in agriculture. After the Krasnodar Krai, they produced the most rice in the entire Russian Federation in 2020. Fruits such as watermelon, grapes and chestnuts are all grown in large numbers and exported across Russia. Livestock herding also plays a large role in the Dagestani economy, with goats and sheep being the livestock of choice. Handicrafts once made up an important part of the Dagestani economy, but faced with globalization, it is of shrinking relevance. As mentioned before, oil, gas and hydropower are all found in Dagestan and play an important part in the Dagestani economy before being transported elsewhere. One of the fastest growing industries in Dagestan is tourism, specifically sports tourism. As you undoubtedly know by now, Habib Nurmagomedov is an Avar MMA fighter from Dagestan and has made the Republic something of a mecca for MMA aspirants. Further success by other MMA fighters such as Islam Makhachev, Magomed Ankalaev and Shamil Abdurakimov are among others who have done little to discourage this reputation. Yet despite all of this, Dagestan is still one of the poorest parts of the Russian Federation. Since the 90s, it has received heavy subsidies from the state, as much as 70% in 2011. This poverty largely stems from geography, as the Republic boasts a population of just under 3 million. Of that, over 500,000 live in Makhachkala itself. The largest ethnic group in Dagestan are the Avars, at 29.4%, with the Dargins at 17%, the Kumyks at 14.9%, then the Lezgians at 13.3%. Dagestan also has 9 other ethnic groups at under 10%, including Russians, making it one of the few federal subjects where Russians are the minority. According to the 2014 survey, around 83% of Dagestanis profess Islam as their religion. 9% believe themselves to be spiritual but not religious, with 3.4% professing Christianity, 2.4% of that being Russian Orthodox. Atheism and pre-Islamic Caucasian faiths are at a steady 2%, with 0.6% of people giving no answer. Drug abuse rates are lower than the national average, at 15.53 incidents per 100,000 people. Alcohol too is far below the national average, at 29.3 incidents per 100,000 people, reflecting the Islamic nature of Dagestan. The President of the Republic is Sergei Melnikov, who's been in charge since the 5th of October 2020. Born in the Moscow Oblast, Sergei is half Russian, half Lezgian, and is not a member of the United Russia Party, though he has been a secretary of the party since the 9th of June 2021. He replaced former head Vladimir Vasilyev on health grounds. As a republic, Dagestan has a constitution, which interestingly allots a certain amount of seats for each of the 15 main ethnic groups of Dagestan. This is specifically to avoid incidents of inter-ethnic violence or tensions, and has worked surprisingly well so far. Despite its turbulent history and current economic woes, Dagestan rightfully claims to be one of the most striking places in the Russian Federation. From the natural wonder of the Salatsky Gorge, the deepest natural gorge in Europe, to the imposing views of Mount Bazarduzu, Dagestan is blessed with dramatic scenery. The architecture of the region too is quite unique, with the hauntingly serene ghost town of Gamsutlemir, over 2,000 years old and 1,400 metres above sea level, as well as the imposing ancient walls of medieval Derbent and the Persian fortress of Narinkala, to name but a few. Dagestan is a land of mountains and of tongues, a land of natural beauty and ancient history, but also a land of economic and spiritual divisions. With any luck, the region will be able to monopolise on its current fame and interest, as well as shed its fundamentalist past which few want to return to. My name is Andrew, and thank you for watching. Up next is the Republic of Ingushetia. Baka!